So just a reminder that we are recording this because we would like to ensure that this is something that others who weren't able to attend are able to enjoy. So hope that is okay with everybody. So welcome everybody. My name is Lori Prue and I am a part-time managing director with the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance. And I also live with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. We're here today to bring together experts to help educate patients or people with lived experience and other health conditions, because I think this is broadly applicable to so many of us, about drug discovery and clinical trials. And so the next phase of our learning series is really about understanding how drugs are approved and regulated in Canada. And one of the things that we do with CAPA is at least provide input into many of the health technology assessment and reimbursement processes for prescription drugs or medicine. But to be able to provide that input, right, we need to be informed of the process and understand this, right? So that we can provide sort of knowledgeable and informed feedback and know how it all fits in. But before we get started, I wanted to do just a brief land acknowledgement, just by acknowledging that I am in particular in Ottawa, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Nation or the Algonquin peoples. And I would like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. And I know that we all come from different places across Canada, and I just thought that maybe you could take a moment to reflect on the land you live, work, and play on out of respect to the Indigenous peoples where you are located. Just briefly a little bit about CAPA. And so we'll have a couple just introductory slides. We are co-hosting this webinar with Global Healthy Living Foundation. So I'm going to play a pre-recorded video of Adam Kegley from Creaky Joints or Global Healthy Living in the next slide. But CAPA, or the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance, we're involved in sort of three main areas, which is providing education and support to people that live with various forms of arthritis. And so here I've just, maybe a little plug for our next webinar, which is occurring on June 8th. And it will be about parenting while living with arthritis, for example. But this is, one of a number of different webinars that we offer. We also advocate for patient perspectives in policy making. So you'll see that as examples throughout our website. Just put a few examples here in terms of how we share that. We also support patient engagement and research. And so, we try to sort of build up the capacity of people with lived experience so they can contribute to research that affects people living with the condition. So anyways, that's just sort of briefly a little bit about us. With that, I think I'll just go to the pre-recorded message from Adam Kegley, who couldn't be here today, but wanted to share.
Thank you, Lori, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. My name is Adam Kegley, and I'm the Associate Director of Global Partnerships at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, or GHLF, which is the parent organization of Creaky Joints. We are really delighted to co-host this very important webinar with our partners, the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance, CAPA. I do apologize I can't be with you live today due to a conflict, but I'm very happy to be co-hosting in spirit with Lori and CAPA. For a bit of background about Global Healthy Living Foundation, our mission is really to place chronic disease patients at the center of their own care by supporting them and those who care for them through education, advocacy, research, and support. Our organization initially focused on inflammatory arthritis, but has since broadened our efforts to include a range of conditions such as migraine, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, osteoporosis, and many more. While I won't cover everything on this slide you see, I do want to highlight a few key initiatives to give you an idea of our work. As I mentioned earlier, we manage the global digital communities like Creaky Joints, providing a ton of educational content and resources for free. Specific sites like Creaky Joints Canada are available in English and French. Creaky Joints Australia and Creaky Joints Espanol, which is of course in Spanish, cater to all of the diverse communities worldwide that we support. Patient Spot, which is formerly known as Arthritis Power, is our comprehensive platform that functions as a research registry, disease monitoring, and resource distribution hub. And this tool is accessible globally for free, and it's crucial in gathering patient data that supports research, education, and advocacy initiatives. In Canada, we've established patient councils that guide our advocacy and education efforts. Among other activities, our collaboration with CAPA over the years has been really instrumental in advocating for patient input submissions to and completing those to CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. We work together to raise the voices of patients on social media and engage with national and provincial health leaders in Canada in doing so, really helping to ensure that patient perspectives are included in policy and decision-making processes. We're also able to contribute with disease-specific and omni-disease education that informs and provides tools to help patients understand innovative treatments better and how best they might approach conversations with their doctor. Today's webinar on how to get drugs approved in Canada is really significant, as we'll be focusing on how Health Canada approves and regulates these treatments. And we're very fortunate to have a wonderful guest speaker from Health Canada today, who Lori will introduce in a moment. So I just wanted to say again, thank you all for joining us today. We're very committed to helping patients put themselves at the forefront of their care together with CAPA, and to just enhancing these access to innovative treatments. So I hope you find the webinar as informative as I know it will be. Now I'll hand it back over to Lori to introduce our guest speaker.
So just briefly, a little bit about our two organizations. I really want to spend the bulk of our time today, giving the stage to Heather Cherry. A few housekeeping items. Like I said, we'll be recording this webinar and it will be uploaded to the CAPA and Creaky Joints YouTube channels and websites for education purposes. The webinar is intended for education, information, and communication only, and of course wouldn't constitute sort of medical advice. If you do have any specific questions about that, of course, reach out to your physician for advice. We'll be asking a couple of questions to our guest, Heather, but throughout the presentation, if you wish to put any questions into the chat box, I highly encourage you to do so, and we'll have a dedicated time at the end for questions and answers. And we have actually two other people here from Health Canada as well who are here to answer your questions. So I would really, really encourage you, once we hear Heather's presentation, to ask your questions, and because it's our chance as patients or people with lived experience to get some of those answers. So next I will gladly pass the floor to Heather Cherry. Heather has a Bachelor of Science in Biopharmaceutical Sciences from the University of Ottawa, also my alma mater. She's worked in healthcare, or worked at Health Canada for over 15 years and is a senior regulatory project manager. Her experience at Health Canada comes from managing not just innovative drugs, but also working on generic drugs. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Heather.
Okay, thanks so much for having me today. I hope everyone can hear me. As Lori mentioned, my name's Heather Cherry. I'm currently an acting manager in the Regulatory Project Management Division within the Pharmaceutical Drug Directorate, which, as you can see, can you see my screen with the full screen, or are you seeing the split screen?
It's full screen.
It is. Okay, perfect. I have three screens, so I just want to make sure I'm showing the right one. So that's great. So my area of expertise is really around the regulatory project management of prescription pharmaceuticals. So just wanted to put that out there. There was obviously a lot about Health Canada that I don't have the expertise to answer questions on, but I'll do my best. And my colleagues are here as well, who work largely on the transparency piece, which will be touched on this on one of the slides. So if you have questions about transparency, they are the experts on that. And also, just given that this is recorded, I really just wanted to put in the caveat that this is a point in time picture of drug regulation in Canada. There could be changes and things that come up about after today that obviously, but as of today, this is accurate information for drug regulation in Canada from the Pharmaceutical Drugs Directorate. So I'll touch on the governance, basically the structure of Health Canada, and then go into the pre-market approval of drugs, including the regulatory and legislative framework, intellectual property, pre-market drug approval process, alternate pathways, transparency, and what happens after drugs are approved by Health Canada. In a limited summary, given our time limitations today. So as I'm sure you're aware, Health Canada is a very large organization. So our group is within the branch, the health products and food branch. So there's many other branches, but that is the one that this presentation is relevant to. And then we also have the regulatory operations and enforcement branch, which I'm not a member of, but we do touch on some of their activities as they are basically responsible for inspecting and maintaining establishment licenses. So within the health products and food branch, there's a number of directorates where essentially the health products and food are divided into different areas in order to put our expertise in the right place. So we are within the Pharmaceutical Drugs Directorate. Also, similar directorates that we work with quite closely are the Biologics and Radiopharmaceutical Drugs Directorate and the Natural and Non-Prescription Health Products Directorate. We all do very similar work, but just for different categories of drugs. And I will also, sorry, I should also mention that the Marketed Health Products Directorate also is one that we work closely with. They do all of the post-market monitoring of marketed products for all of our directorates products. So some statistics on the marketed drugs in Canada. As of March 2024, there was a total of 13,200 drugs marketed in Canada. Over 11,000 are human drugs, and of these, over 10,000 are pharmaceuticals, i.e. as opposed to biologics. And of the pharmaceuticals, over 8,000 are prescription and the rest are non-prescription. Veterinary drugs also get drug identification numbers, so they're also included here as well, as do disinfectants. And just to mention that there's obviously other activities that include the approval of medical devices, which isn't captured here, but those are also reviewed within our branch. So just in case you need a refresher on the Canadian legislative and regulatory framework, we have acts, which are the legal authority to the government, and in this case, specifically to Health Canada, to regulate and oversee the development and marketing of drugs. The act we work under most of the time is the Food and Drugs Act. And then under acts, we have regulations, which are legally enforceable interpretations of the acts. And then we also have guidelines and policies, which are not legally binding. They interpret the regulations and provide details of how to meet regulations, but they are not law and they allow flexibility in interpretation. Within Health Canada, we also, as much as possible, apply the ICH guidelines just to be consistent with international practice and as well to not duplicate the work that the international body has already done. So as I mentioned, we have the Food and Drugs Act. Under that act, there are a number of regulations. The ones that are most relevant to us is the Food and Drug Regulations. This regulates the clinical trials and drugs, as well as mentioning data protection provisions. There's also medical device regulations, natural health product regulations, and the regulations allowing us to charge fees is also a set of regulations. And sometimes we also encounter the authority of the Patent Act, which has the patented medicines NOC regulations, as well as certificate of supplementary protection regulations, which do come into effect quite a lot for drug approvals. So first I'll touch on just the fact that the Food and Drug Regulations do have Division 5 about clinical trials. Lori mentioned that you had previous presentations on the topic of clinical trials. So just to mention that in order to sell or import a drug for the purposes of a clinical trial in Canada, an application must be submitted to Health Canada to obtain a no objection letter. And this is outlined in Division 5 of the Food and Drug Regulations. So they submit a formal clinical trial application. And in the case of pharmaceutical products, that is submitted directly to the Office of Clinical Trials, or OCT, in the Pharmaceutical Drugs Directorate. And then OCT has 30 days to render a decision on the CTA. And more details are available on various guidance documents on our website, such as this one. I personally do not work in the Office of Clinical Trials, so admittedly, this is not an area I have a lot of expertise on. But all of the additional information is outlined in the regulations and various guidance documents. And then the regulation of a drug submission or of a drug product is covered by Division 1 and Division 8 of the same regulations. So in order to market a new drug in Canada, a submission must be filed, and both a drug identification number and a notice of compliance must be granted for that product. To obtain these, manufacturers must provide strong evidence of the product's quality, safety, and efficacy, which is detailed in the regulations. So the sponsor generally starts by filing a new drug submission, which must include sufficient evidence of the product's safety, effectiveness, and quality, including, for example, manufacturing details, preclinical data, clinical data, including substantial evidence of effectiveness, the proposed labels, and a brand name assessment. Health Canada, in the case of prescription drugs, it's PDD, reviews the evidence and decides whether the benefits of the product outweigh the risks. And if approvable, a DIN and an NOC is issued, which essentially is the market authorization. The regulations also require that sponsors file supplement submissions to receive a notice of compliance for any significant change, such as new indications, new dosage forms, strengths, route of administration, or significant manufacturing changes. We, of course, also have generic drugs, which are covered by the same division of the Food and Drug Regulations. A generic drug is a copy of a brand name drug, and essentially they must demonstrate that when they file their drug application. It has to contain the identical medicinal ingredients in the same amounts and in a similar dosage form. And these are filed as an abbreviated new drug submission, and they must be compared to a Canadian reference product. So the Canadian reference product is essentially the innovator product, and the generic must be the pharmaceutical equivalent of that drug. It must be bioequivalent. It must have the same route of administration and the same conditions of use, or the conditions of use must fall within the conditions of use for the CRP. And CRP is also defined in the regulations, fairly technical, but essentially paragraph A is the one that usually applies here, which says that it is the marketed product by the innovator that then is used as the Canadian reference product for any generics. Also, just a note on biosimilars, these are not regulated under PDD, but if there is a biologic new drug submission and an innovative biologic product, it can't be a generic of it for scientific reasons. And so they have a provision around biosimilars, which is outlined on this slide. Essentially, it can show to be similar to the innovator product, but they still need their own additional clinical data, more studies for the regulatory authorization of a biosimilar because of the way biologics are manufactured. There is it's not really possible to show the identicalness that is needed for a generic. So BRDD, the directorate that reviews biologics, has this in place for biosimilars. One of our most important guidance documents in terms of explaining what we do is the Management of Drug Submissions and Applications Guidance document. Its most recent update was in 2022. This guidance document benefits both external and internal users of the process. It provides clarification to sponsors of the way in which PDD and BRDD manage information and material submitted by sponsors. And it provides a framework for Health Canada to manage the flow of drug submissions. For example, it outlines acceptable practices, performance targets, the handling of submission information, procedures related to drug review, and requests for clarifications. The guidance is updated periodically to reflect changes in policies. And hopefully the intent is that it reduces the requests for clarifications for sponsors, and as well any questions that Health Canada staff might have about the process. So feel free to follow this link to that guidance if you're interested kind of in looking at the timelines and the flow of when a submission comes in and kind of how it moves through the process. I'll go through some of that in the following slides. So the MDSA also outlines kind of what is mentioned in the regs, what I've already mentioned. We have the new drug submission, and then those can also have a supplement to a new drug submission, which are generally for innovative or at least not generic drugs. These typically have 300-day timelines, although there's variations in that. And then abbreviated new drug submissions or generics, as well as supplements to those, generally have 180-day timelines. There's also a drug submission category for extraordinary use new drug submissions, for authorization of new drugs under extraordinary circumstances. It's a very limited scope and is essentially to capture drugs that can't run clinical trials. One example is for antidotes for military kind of weapon warfare products. You can't test these treatments. So that's one case that this set of regulations has been used. And then, of course, there's also mention of the CTAs, although, as mentioned before, they also have their own guidance to give a lot more details on those. Other drug submission types and more details on timelines are listed in this guidance as well. So some of the variety in timelines are also mentioned in this and in other guidances. We have an option for priority review. If a new drug submission or a supplemental new drug submission is intended for the treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of serious life-threatening or severely debilitating disease or condition for which there is substantial evidence of clinical effectiveness and no product on the market, essentially, then a company can apply for a priority review. And if granted, then they would have a 180-day timeline instead of 300. And then we also have an option for notice of compliance with conditions. Company can ask for advanced consideration of following this pathway if they have, similarly, it's for a drug for serious life-threatening and severely debilitating diseases or conditions for which no drug is presently marketed and that has promising evidence of clinical effectiveness. Essentially, they haven't done the phase 3 clinical trials yet, but can apply under this policy if they feel as though the drug is promising enough that it should be on the market and will be granted a notice of compliance with conditions. This is used a lot of times for oncology drugs. That's an example, although it can be for other drugs too. And then we have extraordinary use new drug submissions, which, as I mentioned, are outlined in the regs. So it's a mechanism for authorization based on limited clinical data. The MDSA also outlines the process for pre-submission meetings. So companies can request a pre-submission meeting to meet with Health Canada to discuss their submission before they file, essentially. So that is detailed in the guidance. And then following the pre-submission meeting, they would make the submission filing. We receive it, it is processed, and then it enters a screening period followed by a review period. And then a decision is made. If it's an approvable decision, then it goes on to be monitored under the post-approval framework by MHPD, and as well, they can file post-approval changes like supplements. If it gets a negative decision, they have a chance to respond, and then the circle begins again. If that response also gets a negative decision, then it essentially is kind of a final decision, although they can go through reconsideration. So the next few slides talk about the screening, review, and decision. So as mentioned, it's received, it's processed, it goes into screening. During screening, we can also issue it a deficiency notice if there's significant deficiencies from the submission, data is missing or it's not meeting our regulatory requirements right off the bat, or it's accepted into review. At that point, they're also paying 100% of the fee because we are cost recovered for drug submissions. And then during review, there can be a variety of groups involved in the review to put the expertise where it's needed and to be as efficient as possible. So often they'll happen concurrently. There could be a clinical review, quality review, label review. There could be other groups involved as well, such as biostatisticians, or the post-marketing group could be reviewing a risk management plan. There could be a brand name assessment, as mentioned under the label review. So part of our role in the regulatory project management division is to project manage these submissions, make sure everything's happening as it should concurrently, and that hopefully the review is completed and a decision is made before the target date. So as mentioned, they can get a negative decision. There's two options for negative decisions. A notice of deficiency is if there's deficiencies or significant omissions that preclude the continuation of the review. So it's so deficient that the review cannot finish. Or if the submission's able to be fully reviewed, but it is still deficient or incomplete in complying with the regulations, a non will be issued, a notice of non-compliance. And then following the nod or non, the sponsor provides a response and a new review period begins. And if the issues still remain and were not addressed, a nod withdrawal or a non-withdrawal are issued, which is a final decision that can then go to reconsideration if they would like. And if issues in a nod were addressed, but new concerns were identified during the remainder of the review, a non may be issued for the same file. As mentioned, we also have cost recovery. Health Canada has been charging fees to industry since 1995, and then they were last updated in 2020. So there are some links here that if anyone's interested in reading the cost recovery regulations or guidance, essentially the fee is calculated based on the contents of the submission. If we review the submission and we miss our performance standard, so we don't make a decision by that 300-day or 180-day timeline, then the sponsor is entitled to a 25% rebate for the missed target. So that's kind of a whirlwind of the drug regulation process. So just going into a couple other relevant topics here. We have the establishment licensing and good manufacturing practices, which are also covered by the food and drug regulations. They're administered by another branch, the Regulatory Enforcement and Operations branch, formerly known as the Inspectorate. So Division 1A of the Food and Drug Regulations talks about drug establishment licensing. So any sites that include fabricators, packagers, labelers, testers, importers, distributors, or wholesalers are required to have a drug establishment license. This ensures evidence of good manufacturing practice, and DELs can be suspended or other actions taken They can have terms and conditions, or there could be things like recalls that could impact the compliant or the status of the DEL and change it from a compliant site to a non-compliant site. So inspection of clinical trials, good pharmacovigilance practice, and other compliance with regulations are also covered by ROBE. And then, yes, there's also risk management side, which is generally more managed by the Marketed Health Products Directorate within HPFB, and drug shortages, working closely with ROBE as well. So as issues come up that impact products on the market, there can be a variety of scenarios that evolve and different actions that need to be taken. But that's kind of all under the purview of Health Canada as well. So touching on transparency. So as part of our department's commitment, we want to be transparent as much as possible around what we do and what our decisions are. So we have as our main transparency kind of available web page is the Drug and Health Product Portal, DHPP. The goal for the DHPP is to be the main source of publicly available information about health product safety and use. All information available through the DHPP is approved. So it's kind of a guaranteed place to find authorized information. And anyone can use the DHPP to search for information about drugs, for example, by brand name, by active ingredient, by DIN. So within the DHPP, we have regulatory decision summaries, or RDSs. So as mentioned here, the RDS explains Health Canada's decision for the product seeking market authorization. They're not posted for every submission that's filed with us, but they are posted for all new drug submissions and supplements, including any supplements for new indications. And then if submissions are within scope of this, but are then canceled, there's a summary of cancellation posted. And then there are also SBDs available on the DHPP. A summary basis of decision is a more detailed document which explains why Health Canada authorized certain drugs and medical devices for sale in Canada. The document includes regulatory safety, effectiveness, and quality considerations. And SBDs are posted for new drug submissions for new active substances and for biosimilars since 2005. And then for products that have an SBD, there's also a post-authorization activity table for any eligible products approved after September 2012. So they are also available on the DHPP. We also have the summary safety reviews available on the same portal. These are generated by the Marketed Health Products Directorate. They're kind of continually monitoring safety of health products to identify and assess potential harms. And so if they identify an issue that requires a summary safety review, it will be posted on there as well, following the review of a potential safety issue. We also have product monographs, which are the labeling document approved by us at the end of review. They are they're kind of created by the company, but then they're reviewed and approved by our group. So they are also considered an approved government sanctioned document that can be relied upon to have the relevant information about the product and what's actually approved for that product. These are also accessible through the DHPP. Also, another link on that portal is the COVID-19 vaccines and treatments portal. Other transparency initiatives where there's hyperlinks here in the presentation, or obviously can be found through Google as well. But there's the submissions under review list, which as is obvious by the title, is a list of submissions under review. So when submissions go through screening and enter review, they are added to this list, and it includes all submissions that are NDSs, as well as any SNDSs for new uses. The submission is removed from the list if it's canceled or if a final decision is made, and then that decision or cancellation is detailed in the RDS or the summary of cancellation, as mentioned on the previous slide. There's also a separate list for generic submissions under review, which was implemented in 2018. Also, in terms of transparency, there's the public release of clinical information. So this is still fairly recent in my opinion, but just in case you're not aware, data about the tests and trials that were performed on drugs and medical devices to evaluate their safety and efficacy are posted at this link. Clinical information is proactively released following completion of Health Canada's regulatory review, and then clinical information is also available on request for previously reviewed products. There's also the drug products database, which is and the availability of products in Canada by DIN. So it will say whether a DIN is marketed or canceled or approved but not marketed by its DIN status. And this will also have a link to the approved product monograph in PDF. And then there's the NOC database. So as mentioned, the NOC is the authorization, the notice of compliance, and there's a database which includes all NOCs issued since 1994. There's also a separate website for the notice of compliance with conditions, which are, of course, the products with promising evidence. Conditions are placed on them, but then they have to complete trials after their approval. And so details of what their commitments are listed on that page. And then there's also a clinical trials database. With the link there. So what happens after drugs are approved by Health Canada? As I'm sure you're aware, there's not quite a straightforward link between Health Canada approval and patient access. There's a lot of things that can complicate this. There's, of course, us working with the drug companies to get market approval and post-market monitoring. There's, of course, the pricing and price negotiation going on with the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board and other federal or provincial or territory public drug plans. There's the health technology assessments, post-market safety research, reimbursement, as well as pharmacy authority and involvement, and then the role that physicians play in this as well. And then, of course, there's advocacy from patient groups, which plays a big part in the landscape as well. So typically, many things often happen before something gets to the patient. It can either, of course, go through private drug plans or hospitals or the health technology assessment, and then the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. There's the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance price negotiation and the various provincial and territory ministries of health. I should have mentioned this actually, as I'm sure you're aware, CADF has recently changed its name. I forgot to update this slide, but it's mentioned on here. So we also, in the attempt to kind of help with some of this, we have put into place an aligned review with health technology assessment. So there's an option for sponsors to formally align review of all qualifying submissions in partnership with CADF, now known as Canadian Drug Agency, as well as INESS. This is a voluntary process where the sponsor can opt into an aligned review pathway and consents to information sharing between Health Canada and the HTA. So it allows the parallel review of Health Canada and HTA with this information sharing. It can help to minimize the lag time between the NOC or the NOCC issuance and the reimbursement recommendation by the HTAs. The consenting to information sharing may save time and reduce duplication of effort for the company. However, sponsors are still required to comply with the requirements of both Health Canada and the HTAs because they have different requirements. And my understanding is that the HTAs look at slightly different data to support their recommendations. And there's this is the link to the notice that talks about the aligned review process. As mentioned, we also have the Marketed Health Products Directorate, which is, this is just a snapshot. There's obviously a lot of post-market reviews that they do. They do signal assessments, so they evaluate available evidence for adverse events, and they may recommend regulatory actions if needed. Causality assessments, so medical assessments of causality between a suspected adverse event and exposure to marketed health product. They may be part of the signal assessments. They also do risk management plan reviews, which is a plan that can help establish or evaluate proposed changes to pharmacovigilance activities, risk minimization measures, and post-marketing commitments. They monitor the receipt and review of new safety information that can come in through PSORs or PBERs. And monitor the market authorization holders' compliance with good pharmacovigilance practices. They can also review other pharmacovigilance information, and they conduct benefit risk assessments to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to demonstrate that the benefits of a product continue to outweigh the risk. Occasionally, this might lead to a significant change in market status of the product. In most cases, when there's an issue with a marketed product, we have found that the company is willing and kind of very on top of it and willing to voluntarily pull the drug from the market, although we would have the authority to also withdraw the product from the market if needed. So here's some other information about post-market resources and communications available on the website. As mentioned, this is not the area that I work with, so there's definitely I have a limited knowledge of everything that MHPD does as part of their post-market surveillance. So that brings me to the end of the slides. I did include some other reference slides, which given the nature of this presentation, I didn't want to bore you with things that weren't that relevant, but they're more than welcome to be shared amongst yourselves in case anyone's interested in some of the details around regulation.
Great. Thank you, Heather. I know that's a lot of content to cover in a short amount of time, but I'm glad we do have some time left here. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I've received a few just privately, mostly from individuals. Of course, I've got like a bunch myself that I can add in after I've gone through these. First question, which probably was relatively straightforward to answer, is like, could we have a copy of the presentation after that? Perhaps we can share with participants. I can upload to the CAPA website. So don't know if that's okay with you or.
I'm okay with sharing it. I would ask that it maybe not be posted. I guess it can be posted on the website. I don't know, just with the caveat that it's kind of a point in time and it's subject to change.
Yeah, for sure.
But yes, it's all publicly available information.
Yeah. No, we can, I mean, if you were comfortable, we could always put it, the date around it or, as of, because, as you've noted, right, there's a Canada Drug Agency, we're at a time of change here, definitely. There was also a question about, you talked about the approval of a drug based on effectiveness, right? And somebody asked, well, how can a provincial government, for example, in Ontario, in the case of this person, then excluded from the provincial drug program based on that same sort of criteria? So just kind of questioned, I guess, how these processes fit together.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly all of the considerations that the provinces make when they make their assessments. I think they're looking at it more from the point of view of reimbursement and coverage and like a cost perspective to themselves, it's from a different perspective. The drug works, it's approved to work in a certain population. The provinces may be saying like there's other products available and this one's more expensive, or they may be saying there's generics that could be used instead of this other drug, or I don't know, that's just a bit of speculation, but I know that they take different considerations into their assessments than we do.
Right, okay. Sounds good. Yeah, and I mean, there was just a comment more in terms of the slide, and like you said, it is very complicated, and I think your slide sort of shows that. And but I mean, that might be a good comment for us in terms of how we might be able to kind of depict these processes in a more clear, user sort of patient-friendly way, for example. So that was something there. Anyway, so because it is complex, unfortunately, and there's a lot of different players, there are a lot of different organizations involved when you think of like, from the discovery of a drug in the lab to when we can access it and it's paid for, ideally, by the provincial drug programs, or say by a private insurer, right? Because we get access in a few different ways. There was also a question about how, drugs in Canada have often, Canada's not like kind of one of the main markets, right? As I'm sure you're aware, Heather. And many have been sort of approved by the US, by the FDA. Right? Does Health Canada reference sort of any of the analysis done by the FDA and take that into consideration when approving the drug? So maybe you can speak to that a little.
Sure. Yeah. So in order for us to be able to review and regulate a drug, we need the company to file an application with us. So that's always the first requirement. If they don't file it to us, then we can't approve something, even if it's approved elsewhere in the world, unfortunately. But if we do have a submission in-house, there are a few international workload sharing type of initiatives ongoing. They require various conditions to be met, and the company has to agree, of course, and it involves discussion. So there's various MOUs that need to be set up with different international regulators. But it is possible, and we do try to do it as much as possible because it makes things as efficient as they can be, both on us and on the company, for kind of limiting the questions that we're asking if they've already received those questions from other regulators, for example. So yes, it is definitely possible. It just kind of requires certain conditions and timing wise things to align.
Right. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, and I mean, that kind of brings me to my question in a way, because I'll get to Louise Binder's question too, because it was also one of mine on my to-do, my sort of potential list of questions. But like, how soon do you start? Like, you talked about that pre-submission meeting, right? Like, do you have the ability, for example, I guess this is always what I wondered, to influence even like what outcomes are selected in the clinical trials, like, that sort of thing. Like, how much influence is there in that process from a Health Canada perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. It definitely varies, depending on the type of drug. Some of them are very well established indications that they're working towards, and there's good indicators that everyone has agreed on. For more kind of innovative or new mechanisms of action, that is definitely part of the discussion that could happen in the pre-submission meeting. A lot of times, that is one of the areas where companies might share that they've already received advice from other regulators. Obviously, we recognize, especially our size, if we make a recommendation on clinical trial design that differs from other regulators, the company's probably not very likely to take that advice, but we definitely try to work with them to identify any issues that we see up front, or say this is a huge red flag and it's going to be an issue during review. So that's one of the benefits of the pre-submission meetings. But yeah, we do see some examples where it is more of a collaborative discussion. Sometimes the clinical trial group is involved in that with their reviews too. They typically look at if clinical trials are addressing safety concerns. If you look at the clinical trial section of the regulations, it's very much about safety and adverse events and things like that. So they can give the company advice on that aspect, but the discussion around what are good endpoints and what's a good clinical trial design to kind of guarantee your best success at getting the indication that you want. We do try to have those discussions if companies are asking questions on them. Also with the caveat of, we have resource limitations. So sometimes we can only accept so many pre-submission meetings in a certain period of time, things like that. But yes.
All right. Well, and that kind of got me thinking. I thought it might be a nice segue to another question from our audience, right? Around, are there ways for patients to engage in some of those processes, or like in other things that Health Canada does as well? So not sure if you have any, information around that.
I don't. I know that patient involvement is definitely a discussion that we hear like globally. Everyone is recognizing the importance of building that in earlier and earlier into the clinical trial development. So I can't speak to specifically, like there's not like a specific update from Health Canada on where that is at. But just to say that it is discussion that we're aware is ongoing. I would say that it would be kind of my suggestion, as I'm sure you're already doing, is to work with the drug companies to try to see that the input is given through that way, and then they can always bring up questions to us through the pre-submission meeting discussion. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And I mean, when you look at some of the clinical trials, and I know if you had said it's not necessarily your, or maybe your colleagues too can help if they might have some expertise in that area, but one thing I notice when we do patient input submissions, for, the CDA, right, for some of the reimbursement reviews, I do notice that many of the clinical trials, like the numbers don't seem to be as large in Canada. So it can be hard, I guess, right, to sort of influence that design, at least from what I could see in the arthritis space. But, are they, or do you use like US based clinical trial data to inform the decision, or is there any Canadian data that factors in, or?
Yeah, definitely. As you said, this is not exactly part of my day-to-day work, but I feel as though we do see a mix, like depending on, I don't know what factors, but drug companies will choose different areas to do their clinical trials in for a variety of reasons. And I believe, I speak on behalf of the reviewers, is that we would want the data in the submission to be representative of what we're approving for the eventual Canadian population. Both ethnicity, gender, other things, like all of that is looked at as part of the review. So there has to be some similarities, but I do, like, it's not a requirement that the trials have to be done in Canada. Yeah, they can be in a variety.
Yeah, right. And maybe I know there's maybe one last question here from the audience, and you, in your presentation, just to kind of link it back, you talked about the benefit risk assessment that happens, right? And so we have
Mhm.
somebody asking here in the audience, are things like quality of life factors taken into account, for example, in that benefit risk assessment, or like how does that process, or what does it look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't speak to what it looks like specifically, as I'm not a reviewer, but I know that it depending on the condition or depending on the medical kind of real world scenario is things that we want to be able to be considering. We do, consult with various medical officers, or on occasion we might have a scientific advisory committee, to try to ensure that those types of perspectives are being made. There's that notice of compliance with condition pathway, is also representation of that, consideration that there could be unique situations where the benefit outweighs the risk, even in one population where it might not in another. So yeah, I think I can speak on behalf of them to say that they do take all
Mm,
it what's the word, like all data out there into consideration during the
Right,
review.
right. Yeah, and just some comments more, I think, than anything in terms of maybe it would be nice to engage patients in that process, right? To kind of gain a bit of context, um, around that. And I know there's
Right.
often the concern around proprietary information, but I do think, there are ways, well, the FDA, I know with their FDA representative program and things like that, offer some hope, right? That maybe just, in terms of looking ahead, maybe there's some different ways that we can work together and that sort of thing. But anyways, with that, I know we've just got a couple minutes left, and I thank you, Heather. We've had lots of questions, and I know they're not easy ones to answer, and I appreciate you
I can
answering
stop sharing my
to the
screen.
best of your abilities. But maybe Anna, if we could try that poll just to kind of get a sense as to, like, do people feel, how much do they feel like they've learned a little bit more? Maybe this is an area too that maybe we need to do more, learning around as well, because it is complicated. There's a lot of different things. There's a lot of science that, for people who don't necessarily have a scientific background. I
Yeah.
can't see if the poll is up, but Anna, feel free to just let me know if it's up. Feel free to, or if anybody wants to, because I can't see it, unfortunately. I'll assume it's up. Second poll is up. All right. So I can't see the results, but I will take a good look at it. It'll be registered to our Zoom account. And I thank you so much, Heather, for being here today on behalf of myself, and I know Adam Kegley from Global Healthy Living Foundation. We really appreciate you coming in, helping to educate us on, like, a lot of these different processes, where they fit in different parts of Health Canada as well, because I know sometimes it's not always simple understanding who does what, and there's a lot that goes into, approving a drug, monitoring the effects after it's been on the market as well, and even the manufacturing of it, right? So thanks again. And with that, I wish everybody a good rest of the day, and stay tuned for our next webinar. Registration will be open soon, which will focus on sort of now what happens, right? So there's a health technology assessment that happens with the Canada Drug Agency. There's reimbursement processes. So we're still following the sort of life of a drug. And so where does it go next in the Canadian policy, pharmaceutical policy processes? So anyways, I'll send that to everybody when it does become available, likely in the next week or so. So thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.